higher level purposes than trying to make a bunch of money. I mean, 'cause none of that stuff really has that much meaning anymore. It's connectivity and interaction with others that holds and affecting some real change in the world, since you all of a sudden have insight into how things can be different and how much effort it takes to actually misbehave. It's almost humorous how much effort people go into to make their lives difficult, create problems for themselves, and then gain satisfaction out of solving the very problems they created. And that seems natural, yet it's I think a pretty effective definition of insanity. By the same token, once you start speaking differently and talking about things differently and seeing things in a different perspective, you're the one that's called different and odd and crazy, and people choose not to listen to you and find ways to discount what you're saying. At the same time, they'll turn around and you're the one they call for advice. So go figure. So it's the whole thing's kind of funny, but it's also kind of sad, because people use so much energy just in defining themselves. Thousands of thoughts a day just have to do with self-perception, and when you just drop all that energy that goes into defining some kind of self-perception, that in itself is free. You end up losing about, or I'd say you gain about 90% of your brain that was inaccessible before. And then on top of that, your understanding of things, your thoughts are completely aligned, so that afterwards, when you focus your attention on something, it's complete with no fragmentation at all, no self-doubt, and yet you also can change in a moment's notice if that isn't the right direction anymore. But you move in a direction as if that's the direction you're always going to move in every moment, and apply your full energy and attention into moving in that direction. And so you end up becoming an extraordinarily powerful individual through that experience of dropping this wasted energy and aligning your thoughts and efforts in one direction.
Well, you become very focused.
Yeah.
But without the required energy and concentration to maintain that focus, it's just natural.
Right. Yeah, the idea that it takes effort to focus is just not there anymore. And it's never focus without respect to everything else. So it's focus with wisdom, because the breadth of perspective is a measure of wisdom. And so you get to bring this tremendous ability to focus to bear with respect to everything that's going on in your life, everybody else's lives, and the people that are the recipients of whatever your efforts are.
But, I mean, those are the skills that you have. You said that the purpose is connectivity. So who do you connect with, and why?
I let that unfold on a daily basis. It could be a chance conversation with a checkout clerk at a grocery store, or it could be somebody I do banking with that it's just like a young woman saw me come in the first time I went into a bank to open an account, and she just knew she had to talk to me. She said there was like this glow and this energy around me that just blew her away. She knew there was something special going on. It's always fun to get that feedback, because you never necessarily know what people see. They just always respond to you in interesting ways. And some people can't look at you, they can't really acknowledge you, they almost have to hide in your presence. And other people, they see you and they just open up into that energy, and almost like they've found a long lost friend. And ultimately, human connectivity that's how we survive. And that's one of the reasons that we have so much problem in the world these days, is people don't truly connect with each other, because they feel like that connection opens them up to manipulation, that it puts them at risk. And so because of the way our social structures are developed, connection is almost seems antonym to survival. But if you look at the fact that people can't exist in any healthy state whatsoever in isolation, we're isolating ourselves into mental illness. And if you look at stats from, let's say, the World Health Organization, they estimate that 25% of the world's population, their lifetimes, will be diagnosable with one or more mental disorders, and that the single largest cause of disability in the United States and Canada is depression. Well, obviously something must be wrong with our structures. It isn't that suddenly human beings have become weaker. It's that we've established structures and used each other in a way that's isolating and damaging to the human condition and doesn't support it. And there's statistics everywhere that talk about that. And yet we're consumed with solving all these problems that we created. And you can't turn on the TV without finding some pundit somewhere telling you what's wrong with the world and how things need to be different. And they're taking a very narrow view of the thing that they care about, that they think will make the difference. And really what it is that the entire structure of our society is a problem at this point. And how do you address something? How do you address a problem when the problem basically encompasses everything? It's an extremely challenging question to even ask, let alone begin to answer.
Well, most of those issues have already been addressed through academia to some extent. Talking about the oppressive structures of the economy, the political system, the social system. But most academics I've met aren't enlightened or spiritual or on a path. And so somehow you combine this knowledge that is available out there with a mystical experience to transform people on an individual basis.
Well, I think part of it is because academia thinks they're solving those problems. Just like psychology thinks it understands the underlying causes of mental disorders and has developed specific therapeutic interventions to solve those disorders. And yet the single biggest issue with psychologists that still hasn't been satisfactorily addressed is burnout. So if psychologists actually really do have the answers, then why are they burning out doing the job? It's because those answers are intermediate solutions that are band-aids over the problem itself, including all the work in academia, and aren't really the true answers, the underlying issues that we have. And it's because they essentially postulate a few things and feel like that's defensible enough to build an entire post-positivist structure on top of it, a scientific investigation, come up with conclusions, and then those are the answers, when in fact if you go back to the foundation, in many cases it can't support the conclusions that are eventually arrived at. And so that is the issue, is that we start somewhere in the middle and we think that we're saying some things that are basic, but actually they're not basic enough. And so what we end up doing is coming up with solutions to problems that we created instead of figuring out how to organize ourselves in such a way that we don't create those problems in the first place. I hope that makes sense.
Well, it does to a large extent, and this actually taps into something I wanted to mention earlier, because you've talked about the system, how systems change, and one of the things I've come to understand is the reason why so many people are in a state of dysfunction is because our systems have been based largely upon people in crisis mode needing the systems in order to survive. And so we have become conditioned to always be in crisis mode. And what's happening now is a lot of people are waking up, shifting outside of crisis mode, becoming self-sufficient, and realizing the system doesn't match their needs anymore, and so they're rejecting it. But then there's nothing. We don't have a alternative system yet to replace the dysfunctional system that was based on our previous mode of existence. So when you have all these healthy people or increasingly healthy people who want to live, and our systems don't allow them to live, well, then only one of two things happen. Either the system becomes increasingly oppressive to maintain its survival, or it dissolves and is destroyed and replaced by something else.
Yeah, I agree with that to some extent, except that I don't think that all these healthy people really exist in a true healthy state. It is just better than before.
Yeah.
If you have cancer in 10 parts of your body and you cure it in 6 parts of your body, well, you still have cancer. And so, kind of the way I look at it is people are looking at themselves and judging their health in comparison to something that is completely bankrupt health-wise. And part of that is really well ingrained too, like just the evolution of business in the 20th century. Capitalism, in the way that it has evolved, actually creates the best possible consumers by isolating people, and creating dissatisfaction. When they moved in the 1920s from a needs-based marketing approach to a desire-based marketing approach, at the behest of Edward Bernays, who coined the term public relations, it created whole new opportunities for business and leveraged off this enormous manufacturing capacity that was developed for World War I, which there were some real concerns that it wouldn't be useful because people just didn't need that much stuff that the country now had the ability to produce. But moving to desire-based, well, anytime you create a desire, you create a dissatisfaction, because now the person is not comfortable with where they're at. They'll be comfortable when they have acquired whatever you have created a desire for. And so we end up becoming a very materialistic society, and that came to fruition with the X generation and he who dies with the most toys wins approach. And so from a spiritual point of view, being happy with where you're at now is absolutely critical to any progression along the path. And that's completely opposite of what our business institutions actually promote. So we're surrounded by things designed to create dissatisfaction so that we have desire to improve on things. And so ultimately, things like that back in the day were survival issues. And so if your survival's at threat, you're darn right you're going to be in crisis mode. And that's part of the problem is that we have been pushed into a manipulative environment that has us in a constant crisis mode, a constant mode of dissatisfaction, which doesn't help relationships, it doesn't help family, it doesn't help any of our efforts as people in the world. And that's why the way that we've structured things to this point has been extremely destructive to the human condition. But then that just creates opportunities for other business. You throw people in prison that don't conform. You actually sell medication to people that can't handle it. So our society, in effect, wastes some of the most sensitive, important people in society because they don't have the thick skin, so to speak, or the lack of awareness to be able to tolerate what's being done. And you also mentioned, as far as healthy people go, a response to this type of manipulation in the 1980s was the EST movement. The Warner program is designed to release all the social conditioning by force. And what people became is very effective, self-centered sociopaths, where they're going to get theirs first because they had complete freedom from social constraints. Well, that actually is not the point. That's like a drug-induced experience of spiritual awareness that has no real context at all. So you have this wonderfully expansive experience, but it's without a context. It's without the social connectivity. It's that I don't need anybody but myself. I have this great relationship with myself. I'm free of constraints. I can do anything I want. I can go anywhere I want. I can take anything I want because I deserve it. I worked hard for it. And it's exactly the opposite of what a true spiritual experience is like. And yet it has a lot of powerful consequences in terms of what a person can do in the world. And so really what the S program was doing was creating really good sociopaths that weren't necessarily doing anything horribly dysfunctional in society from a disruptive point of view, but all the same, people like that really pervert what self-awareness and spirituality is all about.
So then what is the healthiest response you can come up with to being awakened and being in this dysfunctional world?
Well, I think I've met two people at two separate mental hospitals that were that had gone through a spiritual transition and didn't know how to deal with it and didn't have anyone around them that understood what was happening. So they ended up having their freedom taken away from them. And what I realized in meeting these two individuals is that they had important things to say, they had important experiences. However, they were unable to communicate to the world in an effective way. So the number one is you always have to take perspective with respect to the environment that you're in. And if you're going to communicate, you have to have, no matter how incredibly mystical your experiences are, how incredibly profound your understanding of how the world is the way it is and how it could be different. If you can't communicate that, if you can't work from where people are at now, then it's mostly useless information. And in fact, in this day and age, you can end up losing your freedom over it. And I've seen it happen to a couple of people. So you have to be able to communicate, and you have to find a way to express yourself that makes sense for the environment that you're in. It's like this day and age, it makes little sense to talk about miracles so much and to talk about things that may defy the law of physics, because people have reached a point where they know that things shouldn't conflict with science. And if you totally ignore science in favor of a belief system, then the belief system probably isn't that effective. That there isn't anything in the psychological event of awakening, regardless of how mystical it is, and it's highly mystical in terms of the wordlessness of the significant aspects of the experience, that there isn't anything that conflicts with science itself. And it's not to say that it can be scientifically explained, it's to say there's no conflict. It's like really a superset of science. Science just happens to be a part of the whole perspective, the whole understanding, and a useful tool.
So effective communication means sensing what your environment will respond to and picking the right language, adapting yourself, and then building relationships with that.
The ideal is and there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the experience, is that you should be able to express yourself in an infinite number of different ways. And so whatever the situation is, you find the right balance to communicate in that situation. And a lot of it is, it almost sounds like a cliche, a lot of it is actually listening. If somebody feels heard, then they're much more likely to hear you, especially when you're modeling what true listening is like, and that this person's thoughts and feelings are well understood. So when you say something into those thoughts and feelings, that it actually has meaning to that person because they feel understood. So if you just start out preaching and you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that, you need to do this, you need to do that, you will turn somebody's hearing off in a heartbeat, and you'll have a great time talking to yourself because nobody else will be listening to you at all. And that's what happens to a lot of people that feel like they've had a significant spiritual experience, is they want to get out there and they want to tell the whole world about it, tell the whole world how to feel. And in fact, they may be right, they might very well likely be right, but they don't have this perspective to really understand their rightness, and they don't have the knowledge to be able to present it in a way that makes sense. And so they end up going out and looking for a following, and typically they do find it. And so then they preach to the choir, and they have all these people that follow them, and it's a big ego boost. And anything that might have happened as a result of this significant experience is lost because they feel like they've arrived somewhere that now licenses them to have authority over others and tell other people how they should be, because then they too can have that experience. And it's not like that. The actual experience is very different. It's about relating, it's about sharing, it's about learning, it's about receiving as much as you give, which ultimately you end up receiving much more than you give in terms of your own personal growth, regardless of where you're at. When you have a true connected conversation, you walk away having benefited from that conversation, and it's a very satisfying experience for everyone involved.
So it's critical for anybody on an awakening path to maintain authentic relationships with other people.
As best you can. Your relationships will change. That's the other thing, is relationships typically are built around having some expectation of each other, expectation of how the person is, how the conversations will go, what kind of things you do together. I mean, you name it. There's you end up putting other people in boxes, and they put you in a box. And as long as everybody stays in their boxes, relationship goes along just fine. It may not be as connected as what you think it is, because everybody's in their own boxes or have placed other people in these boxes they need them to be in. But it is some form of relationship. When you step outside that box, a lot of people can't handle that. They want you to get back to the way you were before, because that's what they valued in the friendship, is this box that you existed in for them. And so your friendships and your relationships will evolve. So my point more or less is to communicate, to learn how to listen, to communicate, to share. Not tell people what you think, but tell people how you feel. So, and it doesn't need to be all squishy and lovey, or however you want to call it. It isn't like that. You express yourself in ways like if somebody says something to you, you respond back, not with what you think about what they said, but what comes up within you as a result of what they said. And that's actually a true sharing and the basis for a true conversation. And most people don't do that. They're busy, and men in particular fall into this trap. They're busy analyzing and telling you what they think about what you just said, instead of sharing what came up within them. What came up within them is not an analysis. It's a feeling that comes up, and typically what people will do is they'll create an analysis of what somebody said according to that feeling that came up, and then they present the analysis. And so that's the trap that people fall into in communication. So that means that typically you have two people or more talking at each other instead of talking to each other and sharing of themselves, because sharing of yourself is threatening.
Well, analysis implies the attempt to predict something that has a logical structure, that follows a pattern. And so when you use analysis in communication, you get stuck in these patterns that are part of the language. But true communication is intuitive. It's surprising. It's the unexpected.
Right.
And so the way you communicate, it seems, is you don't even know what you're going to say until you say it, and then it surprises you, and who knows, you might keep it, you might leave it, but there's always an unexpected sharing within you that comes to the other person.
The way I like to put it is I've reached a point where I find out what I'm going to say at the same time that the person listening to me hears what I'm saying. So I don't think of anything in advance to say. I get a feeling for a question, and then I start talking, and I use words that describe that feeling instead of performing an analysis that has some predictive features or whatever. I'm not trying to analyze anything when I speak like that. And typically I don't analyze things until after the fact, and then that analysis might be putting a number of separate pieces of a conversation together to form the whole of an opinion. But then even that I hold as just an inference, a possibility. And analysis, the result of an analysis is to come to a judgment. And so you reduce an infinite number of possibilities from a theoretical point of view down to a single cause or predictive element, whatever you want to call it, that's a result of a judgment. And so you lose everything that was possible before that judgment. And where that becomes limiting is there are questions that might require hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of little pieces of information that you can't even intellectually wrap yourself around. So if your life consists of moving from one judgment to another, then when you assemble all those possibilities together, you might be coming to future understandings based on 10 pieces of information instead of 10,000, because you've thrown away a whole bunch of stuff that all taken together might add up to a completely different conclusion. And it's because you spent your time coming to judgment about all kinds of things that were really unnecessary to judge. And so again, it's right back to wasted effort. It's much easier just to not be so tied to your own opinions, your own feelings about things, but just take things as they come, hold things in possibility, and understandings will come as a result of that are much more intuitively based than analytically based. And as far as the patterns of behavior, there's reasons for it. Predictability is synonymous with survival, especially back when we're foraging food in the forest, let's say. Predicting the danger along a certain trail, or that some moving shadow could be a stalking animal. Those kinds of things, those kinds of predictions and judgments are extremely important to survival. So in general, we're designed to establish patterns of behavior. Unfortunately, we've taken it to the extreme where we are just one big pattern of behavior until we step outside of that set of experiences we've had that has moved us to become the person that we see ourselves as, but before we step outside that set of experiences.
So what you seem to do with people is get them to, or help them to, examine their thoughts, recognize all the judgments, recognize all the wasted thoughts so they can become more focused, and then they can become self-sufficient, looking inside themselves and going through the process of awakening, but in a way that does not disrupt their physical ability to function in the world.
There'll be a certain disruption in any awakening to the physical ability to function, but what I help people do is move along that path, because there is completely unaware and there's completely aware, and there are actually no dividing lines. Like, somebody can't say, well, it's a continuum. They can't say, well, this particular milestone here, this is a set place in this continuum that is without pain, and I still accomplish everything I want, so I'll just stop here. There are no points on that continuum except there's a before and after awakening, but there's no point before that is any dividing line whatsoever. So once you're on the path, you're on the path, and it's a lifelong thing. And self-awareness is generating some real interest in the scientific community. They've been studying meditation for years and have found significant positive impacts to meditation. And then looking at self-awareness in general, there's been studies done recently where self-awareness, or the more self-awareness you have, the better decisions you make. So self-awareness is really connected with good decision making as well. So the first thing I do with anybody, there's actually three things that I think are important to start with. And one is to understand where your thoughts come from, which is a matter of tracing back. You have a thought that you want to express, you trace it back to where it started at. So typically, if I'm driving like right now, I might see a sign on the side of the road, and maybe it's the color of the sign or the words on the sign or some aspect of that sign reminds me of something else. And so I'll start thinking down that path, and ultimately I might come to the conclusion that I like green cars because red cars get pulled over more often, even though my preference might be red. Well, that there's no way that looking at that sign could have. There's no way in advance you could understand the progression your thoughts would take. Most people are unaware of where their thoughts start from, and so as a way of basically helping somebody feel less random in nature, I start out telling them to do that. When I did that back in 2003, that took me about 6 months, and finally the way I was able to really stick with it and make it happen was I decided that if I couldn't trace a thought back, no matter how bad I wanted to say what I had to say, I wouldn't say it. And that was like, I was like, all right, well, I guess you're going to have to be able to do this. So, but then the other one is listening, and that took me 3 years to get to. So 6 months, you think difficulty tracing your thoughts back. That took 6 months. It took me 3 years to get to a base point to where I could listen. Not to be perfectly adept at listening, but get to the starting point. Took 3 years of real effort. And then and it's a matter of it's almost a meditative technique, because listening is an art form, but it's a matter of not allowing distracting thoughts to come up in your mind and take you away from really listening to what a person has to say. You can't control the thoughts that come to your mind, but you can control how you respond to them. So it's not allowing your mind to follow a train of thoughts that takes you away from the conversation, because those little micro interruptions in conversations people are accustomed to, but they do disturb the conversation. And that's one of the things that will make a person really feel connected is when they feel listened to, especially when they're used to all these little holes in the conversation. So the trick is if you see that sign and you're riding with somebody and you want to talk about it, then you say, hey, I saw this sign on the side of the road and I find myself buying green cars, and I find that satisfying or whatever. But what you do is you don't just randomly start saying something, because that also creates discontinuities. So in conversation, human connection, the two things that you don't want to do is not listen and create discontinuities in what you're saying. So those are two of the three things. And then the third thing is that when you start doing that, you start recognizing your own patterns of behavior, and at that point you either directly or indirectly become aware that your body represents, just in the way the muscles have formed around your emotionality, whether you're depressed or happy, it'll change the position of your shoulders. That is an emotional stabilizer, and that when your outlook on life changes, your body has to change along with it. So anytime you come to understand something, it takes a while to manifest that understanding, because you're a physiological system that changes more slowly over time. Understandings happen in a moment. The manifestation of those understandings happen over time. There's probably a lot of very significant understandings that have been dropped because they don't make a difference to the person right away. Whereas if they stuck with it and pursued it and tried to model that understanding, then and realize that it's the physical system or the physiological system that creates that time lag, they would be able to stick with understandings and actually progress along the path of self-awareness more effectively. So it's these kinds of pieces of information that I like to add to the conversation. And so because of that, I think it's really important to recognize the importance of some sort of mind-body integrative exercise. Yoga is one of the easiest because it's everywhere, and not the power yoga and Bikram I haven't done. I understand about it a little bit. The idea is that you want to generate that freedom of movement within your body, and so I would recommend something like Yin Yoga. Kundalini Yoga is a little bit more designed not to free the body up as much as I think free the mind up. So you do a lot of body-centric exercises, breathing in that is designed to free some of the blocks in the mind. But depending on what spiritual discipline you're following or how you're trying to accomplish things, that may or may not be useful. It's a very powerful method of becoming more aware, but it isn't necessarily what addresses mind-body integration, in my opinion. That's more doing something like Yin Yoga, which is a lot of seating poses that are designed to stretch and create mobility in the spine and change your musculature in such a way that it frees your body up, which in turn frees your emotions up. And there were some transitions that I made before I even dropped into this process of awakening that 24/7 my body felt like it was in the wrong position, and I had to work with it constantly to get it to feel right again. It's because it represented where I came from and not where I'd come to.